In the previous lesson, I had mentioned that we do have areas like this towel where it seems like part of the geometry is disappearing. If you'll look, we also have what looks like a lot less of our vines here, or our ivy, that's actually growing. So this is actually due to one of the settings that is turned off by default in Mental Ray. So if we scroll down in our Common tab, we need to turn on this Force Two-Sided. So normally I always keep this turned on, so that way it can make sure that both sides of our geometry are rendered properly. So with that turned on, if I were to come in and re-render, there we go, we can see now everything looks exactly as it should. Okay, now on to the gamma correction process. So if we were to come in and just simply start applying textures to some of the surfaces in here, we'll start to notice some problems right away. So to illustrate this, I'll just start by dropping a texture onto this wall. So if I press the M key on my keyboard to pull open the material editor, let's create a new material. So right-click, go to Materials, Mental Ray, and again, drop in the Architectural and Design material. Let's double-click on this, and I'll start by taking my reflectivity all the way down to 0, and let's plug in some kind of a color map for this. So I'll take my color map port, drop this, and we'll plug in a standard bitmap. There we are. And if you take a look inside the Scene Assets Images directory, let's plug in this stone wall color. There we are. Now let's take this material, drag and drop that onto this main wall. And to see this, we can just simply select our material, and let's tell this to actually let the textures be seen here in the viewport. There we are. Now if you double click on this bitmap, let's just very quickly set the tiling up to something like 10 by 10, so that way we get a nice repeating texture in here. Now let's just see what we get if we were to render this out. So again, Shift Q on my keyboard, and you can see sort of the problem that we have. So if I were to get in really close on this bitmap, you start to get a feel for the overall coloration of this image. So lots of yellows, a few kind of light reds in here. But if you compare this image to what we see here in the render, you'll notice that our textures look really washed out and really desaturated. Now the problem is that we have some color correction and some image correction that's happening due to this exposure that we looked at in our previous lesson, or this exposure control. So this is actually doing some color correction on the environment itself, and what this is doing is making sure that the lighting is able to be displayed correctly on our monitors. The problem, though, is that this process basically ruins any of our textures that we apply. So what we need to do is use another process to basically counteract this washing out of our textures. Now, in 3ds Max, this is called gamma correction. So to incorporate this, let's go back to our rendering menu. Down toward the bottom, we have this gamma LUT setup. Let's open that up. Let's first start by enabling gamma correction. We need to turn on this Affect Materials and Material Colors selectors, so that way as we start to choose color swatches and other material colors, things like that, we can make sure that the colors we choose within our little color swatches will match up with the colors that we get rendered, so we don't wind up with this disconnect of what we see in our material editor versus what we see back in our render. So that'll make sure that everything matches back up. Another thing that is very important to turn on is to make sure that the bitmap files that we're bringing in have an input gamma of 2.2. So just about any image that you're going to find from a camera found on the web, JPEGs, bitmaps, Targas, almost all of those have a gamma of 2.2. So what we're doing is telling 3ds Max that, hey, anything that gets brought in already has gamma correction applied to it. So make sure that you go through sort of a reverse gamma correction to make sure that everything looks the way that it's intended. For the output gamma, this one's a little bit more up to you. So if you intend to render your images out as an HDR or an EXR image, then you might want to leave this gamma set to 1. But if you like to render out your images as JPEG, Targa, bitmap, then you'll want to set this to 2.2. So in my case, I'm going to leave this set to 1 because I like to render out as an HDR or an EXR format. but we'll revisit this a little bit later, just to refresh your memory on that. So, gamma correction is turned on, these two checkboxes are turned on as well, and input gamma is set to 2.2. Now with that done, as soon as I click OK, everything looks sort of washed out and immediately looks wrong. That's completely normal. Go ahead and re-render the image, and everything should look normal again. Now you'll notice that now our render, or rather our texture here, looks much, much closer to what we have over here in our material editor. So at this point now, everything material-wise or texture-wise that we plug in should look much closer to its natural coloration. So gamma correction, very, very, very important to make sure that our textures look proper in our render. Now another thing that I'll do is, while we're sort of at this early stage, is maybe come in and add maybe one additional final gather bounce. You'll notice that in my scene everything takes on a little bit more of a yellow coloration, and that's really not what we would get. So by introducing maybe just one additional final gather bounce, we can start to have light that bounces off surfaces and starts to create a little bit more of a natural, kind of a color bleeding effect. So with one additional bounce for my final gather, there we go. Now everything takes on just a little bit more of a natural sort of blue coloration. And at this point it really is not adding any additional render time, so very inexpensive little process to turn on. Now, before we wrap up this lesson, there is one last thing that I want to show you that sort of deals with this gamma correction and the color of our textures that we've been talking about. So while it is really, really important to use gamma correction on anything that you use as maybe a color map or a diffuse map, not all of your textures need to be, or really not all of your textures should be gamma corrected. So the only things that you would really want to apply gamma correction to would be things like color maps, or really anything that's directly responsible for the color of your surface. So colored transparencies, colored specularity, again, diffuse color maps. But any sort of a black and white or a grayscale map, things like bump maps, displacement maps, even normal maps, really anything that is not directly responsible for the color of your surface, those are actually textures that should not be gamma corrected. So for instance, if I were to drop in a bump map, so let's plug in a standard bitmap. For this, if I use my stone wall bump, in these input or these gamma options, right now it's set to use the image's own gamma, which is 2.2. Again, for a color map, that's what you would want, but for any kind of a bump map, specular map, anything that is a grayscale map, this is actually the wrong setting to use. So for these types of maps, we want to use this override option and reset that back to 1. Long story short, this is just a way of ensuring that the information that's contained in here for bump information, for normal information, is not interfered with. So we're going to plug that in, and we need to make sure that our bitmap matches the tiling options that we have set up here. So we'll set this to 10 by 10 and re-render that. There we are, and now we get a little bit more of this kind of a non-flattened surface, so it just adds a little bit of detail onto this. Okay, so now that we have this gamma correction process set up and working the way that it should be, what we can do for the next couple of lessons is take a little bit of time to explore the material application process.